Hello, I'm Dr. Feller, and today we're going to talk a little bit about understanding some keys to effective learning. We're going to tie in some brain research with that, as well as probably meddle just a little bit in lifestyle choices that people need to make to be effective learners. So when we marketed this class and talked a little bit about it, it was basically the process of learning can be greatly enhanced if one knows how the brain works in retaining material. And by changing just a few of your life skills around the study process, but also some daily habits around sleep and caffeine consumption and some of those different kinds of issues, you can greatly and dramatically increase your capacity to learn. One of the things that happened for me in my undergraduate program here at ORU is I bounced around between like a 2.9, 3.0, 3.1 grade average, just kind of up and down through my 4 years of undergrad, and ended up with a 3.0 grade point average. When I went to my master's program and actually took my first class in studying how to learn and what psychology knows about how people learn, I thought, if I can actually make this stuff work for me, I'm going to see if it's real and if it works. And if it can make it work for me, then I can sell that later on as a counselor to help other people with these kinds of processes, and as an educator as well. And so what I did is I dove in full force, just trying to see what I could accomplish through that. And what I found out is that it actually works. I went from that point on through my master's program and on as a 4.0 student. Even though the programs were much harder, even though the learning was much more involved, much more reading, much more capacity to memorize and stuff, I was a 4.0 student from that point on. And it was because I learned to apply these principles. So for the last 23 years, what I've tried to do here at ORU is invite students to step up to that potential that's within them and to learn how they can study less but retain more and become effective time managers in ways that make a big difference for their learning process. So one of the things that we're going to have to address, though, is a couple of lifestyle patterns, because learning is consolidated in terms of long-term memory, and we'll get into short-term sensory, long-term memory, all those different kinds of things today. But learning is consolidated really through that long-term memory process, which is facilitated primarily through sleep. Okay? So we need to know some things about the importance of the role of sleep in cognition before we can kind of lay out the foundational principles of what makes learning work well for individuals. So the first thing is that sleep is not a physical restoration process. A lot of people think, I work all day and I'm muscle fatigued, and sleep is about recovering from that. We find that if we take a professional athlete into sleep labs and maybe do sleep deprivation for 3 or 4 days, their ability to shoot the basketball, and if they're a basketball player, that doesn't get compromised with sleep deprivation. They can start getting a little bit loopy, and after 4 or 5 days of sleep deprivation, they'll become psychotic and be hearing things that aren't there, but their performance physically isn't compromised. We also know that it's not necessarily for muscular development or restoration. You take a weightlifter and you take them into a gym and you do all kinds of physical exertion, expend a bunch of energy, burn the muscles until they get that, what they call the burn. And basically, as long as they stop that exercise and then eat protein, those muscles are going to build back up, regardless of sleep. Sleep is not about physical restoration. Okay? So part of what happens is sleep is for cognitive restoration. I already mentioned that if we don't have sleep, we become psychotic after 4 or 5 days. But we also notice that even with just 1 or 2 days of inadequate sleep processes, that cognitive comprehension, creativity, ability to integrate information, and especially the ability to retain information long term starts getting compromised. So we sleep about 1/3 of our life. And you think, why waste all that time? And unfortunately, far too many college students feel like it is a waste of time, so they stay up late to study extra and all that, and they don't realize the very process that they're doing that they think is going to help with their classes actually compromises or undermines their ability to retain information in the long term. So sleep is about long-term memory consolidation and integration. Part of what happens during the day is the brain is an associative phenomenon, and it connects sights and sounds and smells and touch and memories and experience and all. It's all about consolidating and integrating these very complex neural patterns. Well, the brain needs all that neural network and communication and patterns to encode sight, sound, smells, touch, and everything that you experience during the day. You go to a class, you hear a professor, you read a book, all that material, you're encoding it, you're getting it in there. What happens at night while you sleep is the brain starts trying to figure out, how do I take all that stuff that was encoded and decide what to keep, what to retain, and how to integrate some of those memories so that they're going to be here for a much longer term. That all happens while you're asleep, and we're going to talk about some of the research about where in the sleep process that occurs, because that matters greatly to these lifestyle issues that I said I'm going to challenge you a bit with. Okay, so sleep is crucial for creativity, for insight, for problem solving, for mental capacity. It's important for all of that. So let's talk a little bit about what happens at night when you sleep. We go through these 90-minute cycles all night long. Every 90 minutes, it's actually a little bit more than 90 minutes, so you'll see it spread out over time. But basically what happens is you start here with the stage 1 process, and during that, you're really kind of disconnecting from the outside world. Stage 2 is a little bit deeper, and we start what we call sleep spindles and K-complexes when we measure that with EEG brainwaves, these funny little spikes in the brainwave process. And really during that time, you're starting to disconnect from physical movement and some of those. The motor cortex kind of relaxes and doesn't, so if you're dreaming that you're falling, you're not doing this in the bed. And if you're dreaming you're running, you're not doing this in the bed. It really kind of disconnects that. But when we get to these deeper stages, stage 3 and 4, which is the deepest level of sleep, really we're going to highlight here in a little bit that that's where most of declarative knowledge integration happens, is in this deep wave sleep. And so trying to memorize facts for a class, a lot of that's very important that this happens early in the sleep cycle. As we get farther along in the sleep cycle and these 90-minute rotations, what happens is you can see REM sleep, which is where we come back almost to an awake-like state with a lot of beta wave activity. Part of what's happening during that time, we call it REM sleep because it's rapid eye movement is occurring. It's the most similar to being awake. Once we get past this, though, we're kind of disconnecting from consciousness. So we're not aware of all of this until we fully wake up the next morning. But each one of those REM cycles, every 90 minutes or so, gets a little bit longer. And this is very important because that's where integration of more complex long-term memories occur, and particularly like procedural information. If you're having to figure out how to apply a concept that you actually learned, the facts are integrated here. The application and integration and procedural knowledge is integrated through those REM cycles. So all of that matters for a couple of things that we're going to talk about: how long you sleep, and it matters for how deeply you sleep. And so we'll address some of those. The physiological mechanisms of sleep, I want to just highlight real quickly. And I know this is supposed to be about learning, but sleep is so central and crucial to it that that's where I've started today. So part of what happens is we metabolize glucose in the bloodstream. We convert it into glycogen and store that in the liver and the muscles. There's a whole metabolism process where that energy is converted into adenosine triphosphate. And that's very important for our functioning all day long. The adenosine triphosphate, we peel off phosphates, and as we do so, that becomes energy. So we go from adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate. And so that peeling off of phosphates to make energy for neural restoration. Every time your neuron fires and we have an exchange of sodium, potassium, chloride ions across the membrane of the axon, we need energy to rebalance that for the next neural firing. And so we have sodium potassium pumps that use that energy from adenosine triphosphate. Well, that's one area. Our brain's very active 24/7, and it's peeling that off all the time. Also, all of our muscles, because we store some of this glycogen in the liver and the muscles convert that into ATP and use the ATP to pull off phosphates in order for muscle contractions to occur. Now, why is that important to sleep? Well, when we see the ATP peeling off the phosphates for the sodium potassium pumps, and we see it peeling it off for the muscular contractions as energy. There's a buildup of adenosine because all these phosphates are being pulled off of it all day long. Now that's important because when adenosine docks with the receptors in the brain, part of what happens is it activates the deep slow wave sleep, which we've already mentioned is important for integrating long-term memories, especially around declarative facts. And how many of you have to remember quite a few facts for the courses that you're involved in at the college level? Okay, so caffeine is so close in its molecular shape to adenosine that what it does is it gets in and blocks the adenosine receptors in your brain and keeps the slow wave deep sleep from occurring. So even though you go to bed, and even though you're unconscious and not aware that you're not really sleeping, you don't ever go down to the stage 3 or 4 because the caffeine's blocking the adenosine receptors. It's close enough in shape that it can block the adenosine from getting into the receptor, but not close enough to actually activate the slow wave deep sleep. So caffeine is a big problem. And how many college students consume extraordinary amounts of caffeine during their day? So you get up and have a couple of cups of coffee, you go to Quick Trip for lunch and have a 32-ounce caffeinated drink, and then you go to Nordagio's in the afternoon to hang out with friends, and then you might get a Starbucks later. You hear what I'm saying? And heaven forbid that you actually consume an energy drink because you're going to help you study or something, okay? What students don't know is that level of caffeine consumption is actually undermining their ability to be effective in terms of integrating long-term memories and the kinds of information that you're trying to study at college. So therefore, it's best if there's no caffeine consumption at all, but at a minimum, there should be no caffeine after 2 p.m. in the afternoon. We tolerate caffeine as a drug that people use because it has a shorter half-life than most other drugs. So it will metabolize and come out of your system. So at least, at a minimum, you shouldn't have any caffeine after 2, which I know this is messing with lifestyle because how many will come from ORU and head across to Nordagio's just to hang out with friends, and it becomes a social event, it becomes a study time, all of that, and people think they have to have the caffeine in order to study more effectively. What they're doing is because it blocks the adenosine, it makes them feel like they can stay awake a little bit longer. But then when they actually do sleep, where the integration of memories is going to occur, it's cutting off the part that's most valuable to the sleep process for that long-term integration. So another physiological mechanism is while you're sleeping, there's at least 5 different neurotransmitters that start building up while you're asleep, and they're going to try and wake you up in the morning. They're creating an arousal state for the body. And after you have a full night's sleep, these chemicals are going to work on creating that arousal state. The problem is, if you think, I'm sleep deprived, so I've got to sleep in on the weekend, you're telling yourself, I'm so tired I need the extra sleep. But that buildup of chemicals on Friday night is telling your body to wake up. So now when you say, I'm going to hit the snooze alarm and sleep for a couple more hours because it's the weekend and I can, what you're doing is you're fighting the arousal chemicals in your body. So after 2 or 3 hours of that, you wake up mid-morning on Saturday and I am so exhausted. See, I knew I needed to sleep extra. But the only reason you're so exhausted is because you've been fighting the chemicals that are in your system that have been trying to wake you up. So the very thing that's the problem is the thing that in most students' mind confirms that they needed the extra sleep. It's a problem. You should go to sleep at the same time every night and get up at the same time every morning. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about good sleep hygiene. So a third physiological mechanism of sleep that's important because so many college students end up using this. They're drinking caffeine, so they're not getting good sleep at night. They think they're sleeping enough at night, but it's not the quality of sleep that they need for integrating good memories. And so often what they do if they struggle with any kinds of things is then they try to take a sleep aid. So melatonin is one that is now on the market in America, unfortunately. It's illegal in most other countries, but it's on the market, and so people assume melatonin is related to sleep. I'll just take melatonin. And because we're a society that self-diagnoses and self-medicates and wants everything extra strength over the counter. It's there now, and it's over the counter, so let's just go for it. What most people don't realize is that melatonin is low in the daytime, but it's secreted by the pineal gland, and it's highest right at the first half hour of sleep. So in the first third of that first 90-minute cycle, what it's doing is trying to help regulate your circadian rhythm, which is why it's important to go to sleep at the same time every night, because it's trying to release that to say, okay, here's where the biological clock should be every night, night after night. Okay? The problem is the production of melatonin at night is mediated by the amount of exposure to sunlight during the day. So if you're getting out in the sun during the day, like you should, instead of just hibernating in your dorm room with the curtains closed, if you get out in the sun, then what's going to happen is that melatonin is going to help regulate your sleep cycle. Now here's the challenge. If you think melatonin is a sleep aid and you take it, all it really does is modify your circadian rhythm. So if you're already got a good sleep hygiene and a good time to sleep, now you're shifting when it starts because you took a drug that purposely does that. The only reason the FDA approved melatonin was so that you could take it for jet lag, because it helps shift when your sleep cycle starts. Right? So if you take it and you're traveling halfway around the world because you're an ambassador or something, and you need to be on point when you get there and not all sleepy and worn out, then you can take it over a series of 3 or 4 days. It will shift your circadian rhythm and you'll be ready, but it only works one way going around the world, not the opposite. Do you hear what I'm saying? So it was approved by the FDA for that one reason, but now that it's on the market, people think it's related to sleep, so they take it for everything, which is very problematic, because if you had a healthy sleep cycle and you're taking melatonin because you think it'll help with sleep, it just messes you up further. Okay? So get plenty of exposure to sunlight, but never take melatonin unless you're traveling halfway around the world. It's only for jet lag and shifting your circadian rhythm. It's actually best not to take any sleep aid, because most of them dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they become habit forming. Even though they say they're non-habit forming, they just mean that relative to the more serious drugs that are out there. Okay? So now I know I've meddled a bit. I'm telling you not to take caffeine. I'm telling you not to take melatonin, and I'm telling you to change your sleep patterns. So what is good sleep hygiene? If almost all of the ability to integrate memory into long-term storage, which is what we're here for at college, right? We're trying to take information from a discipline. We're trying to take practical experience from a discipline. We're trying to take both that science and that practice, and we're trying to figure out how can I incorporate that so that I can use it in the future in my career, so that I can pass the test. Unfortunately, a lot of students have figured out a way to pass the test, but in my classes, it's really frustrating because they'll pass the test with an A, and 2 weeks later, I'll ask a student a question about it. They have no clue. And we'll talk about why that happens, because they've learned it enough to regurgitate it in the short term, but it hasn't consolidated in long-term memory. And it's no wonder, because they've sabotaged their ability to have long-term memory. So good sleep hygiene, that's going to be critical for this, since most all of our long-term memories are consolidated and integrated at night while we sleep. The first thing is go to sleep and wake up at the same time every day. Your biological clock is amazing. It will help you be very effective in learning if you'll do that. In fact, once I learned that, I'm not superhuman. This isn't something not anybody else can do. But one of the things that started happening once I did this for a couple of years straight is my wife wakes up an hour after I do. And I didn't want to disturb her, and so I would set my alarm for the time that I would wake up, and guess when I'd wake up every day? 1 minute before the alarm goes off. I'd look over, make sure it was the right time, I'd turn it off, and then go and do my morning routine, and I didn't wake her up or anything, okay? Now, your circadian rhythm's good enough that when my son, who would miss a swim practice, they would have makeups at 5 o'clock in the morning. So we'd have to get up at 4:30 to get him up and drive him there and all that kind of stuff. So on the rare occasion when I'd set it for 4:30 instead of the regular time, guess when I'd wake up? 1 minute before the alarm went off. Your circadian rhythm's that good if you're really doing good sleep hygiene. Well, what else has to go along with this? Get 8 to 10 hours of sleep every night. And I know this is a major meddling with college students' lifestyle. And we're going to talk about why this is so important. Adults need 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. Children need 10 to 12. Infants sometimes need 16 to 18 hours of sleep because of all the neural integration that's happening in that early infancy, okay? But adults need 8 to 10 to be able to do the kind of learning that I'm going to share with you today that you do. You match your sleep cycle with exposure to sunlight. I'm not going to get into all of this because we want to get on to the main part about learning. Sleep in a dark room, because how many of you have ever shined a flashlight through this part of your skin? Red light, right? Well, the same thing happens through your eyelids. It's red light. And guess what? You have more red cones in the retina of your eye than any other kind of receptor. So if you've got a red LED readout on your alarm clock, or you've got a night light in the room, all of that's going to show up as red through your eyelids, and it creates an arousal state because it's stimulus that's going to the brain, and what you want is something the opposite of an arousal state. So get rid of digital clocks, use analog clocks instead, don't have the digital readouts. And even in the sleep labs, one of the things they've done with the research is they've turned the alarm clock around, and just the light bouncing off the wall, off the ceiling, and back down to your eyes changes the depth of sleep and the cognitive functioning the next day. So get rid of all of that. Sleep in a dark room, no red LED readouts. Use the sleeping environment only for sleeping. I know that's tough in a college campus because part of what happens is your dorm room is your social gathering place. It's where you pay your bills. It's where you sit down at the desk across from your bed and all that kind of stuff. But guess what? If you do all those other things in your sleeping environment, then when you go to lay down in the bed in that sleeping environment, where does your mind go? To all that other stuff, because the mind is fundamentally an associative process. So we start connecting with all that other stuff and then can't get to sleep because we're thinking about all of it. So if you use the sleeping environment only for sleep, then your mind, when you go in, you can be that kind of person that lays down, their head hits the pillow, and you're gone. If you're the kind of person that lays down and your mind is just racing a million things, it's probably because you're not using that environment only for sleep. You've conditioned your body and your mind to associate that environment with everything else instead of just sleep, okay? So use it only for sleeping. Avoid the use of caffeine, all of it if possible. Now, the nice thing about caffeine is the side effects of withdrawal are just a headache, okay? In fact, so much so that the medicine manufacturers of the world know that if they were going to put extra strength headache medicine, the active ingredient they put in is caffeine, so they can feed your addiction, because they know that's where most headaches come from, okay? So stop using caffeine, okay? If you do, you're going to have a headache for a day or two. You're going to feel a little bummed out and a little down, not depressed, but kind of like that, like no energy for about a week and a half. And once you do that, you'll be back up at this higher level of functioning than you were when you were doing the caffeine, because tolerance builds up over time. So stop using caffeine. I know that's a major meddle in college students' lives. If you have to, a couple of cups of coffee in the morning or something, but nothing after 2, okay? And we'll see why here in just a minute. Avoid alcohol and tobacco, same issues. Do not exercise right before bed. What we're trying to do, and how many of you have intramurals right before bed in a college campus, okay? Because what happens is exercise creates an arousal state, and we want the opposite of that when it's time to sleep. But we do want to exercise because remember what we said? It burns off the phosphates off of adenosine, which helps create the slow wave sleep. So exercise every day, but don't do it right before bed, okay? So having said all that, let's get to the nuts and bolts of actual learning process, okay? So when we try to encode information, it goes first into sensory memory, which is our immediate experience of sights, sounds, smells, touch, all of that. Sight in the occipital lobe, sound in the top half of the temporal lobe, feelings and pressure, hot, cold, pain, all of that in the parietal lobe. So we have all of these different sensations that come in, and we have an immediate sensory register. And in the sensory register, it creates an immediate awareness of the surrounding environment and the stimuli that we're trying to process, okay? It's almost immediately forgotten as you move on to the next stimuli. so I can see all the colors of the outfits that you're wearing today. I look over here, and now I don't see any of those colors, but I see other colors of the wall and the computer screen and all that kind of stuff. So we lose that fairly quickly. But what's phenomenal about our sensory register is that it excels at recognition. What it does is it matches the immediate stimuli to previous experience. And the way it does that, and I'll just kind of do a real quick kind of almost crude summary of this, because if you get into the real biology, it's much more complex than this. But if you think about the gray matter in your cerebral cortex, that last quarter of an inch where all the synapses and junctions are in your brain, okay, the white matter is all the axons running across to another side of the brain to make connectivity. But where those connections are, they call it striated because it has like 6 different layers of stripes in there. And it's like if I look across the room and I see all the colors of your outfits that you're wearing today, that's hitting my retina, it's going through my optic nerve, back through the thalamus to the occipital lobe, and it creates this pattern or array of billions of neuronal firings to account for the texture and the patterns and the color and all that kind of stuff. That's in the first inside layer. As it goes up, the next layer is going to represent the same thing, but maybe only several 100,000. The next layer, maybe only several thousand. The next layer, so we can have this kind of bottom-up, top-down analysis where that with sensory memory, I almost immediately have billions of neurons firing here, but represented by just 2 or 3 on that outside layer. And so once that happens, and I've seen you once, the next time I see you, that pattern of billions says, does this look familiar? And we do a bottom-up, top-down analysis, and we go, yeah, I recognize that. So how many of you have ever played a matching game? Or like the game of concentration? We're really good at that. Or you see somebody one time walking across campus and you think they're kind of cute. The next time you see them, you immediately recognize them even from a different angle, right? Even though you don't know this person, you haven't experienced them a lot, we're really, really good at recognition. And that's the fatal flaw that most college students make. Because through high school and college, often they've invited themselves to use recognition as their primary learning style. We're all good at it. So it's an easy, lazy way to try and think about learning. Here's the problem. It can lull you into a false sense of knowing, because what happens is a student reads a book or they hear their professor in class, and the next time they get ready to study, they read that and they go, I recognize that, I must know it. No, you don't know it. You're just really good at recognizing, because everybody is. That doesn't mean you know the material. It just means you recognize it. So what happens is they fail to study further because they assume they know because they're so good at recognizing. Unfortunately, in the public school system, we've reinforced that with multiple choice questions. I had a student in class where I was talking about this the other day, and he said, yeah, I came from Germany. And they ask you a question, and then they leave a blank, and you've just got to come up with it. And he said, I came to the United States, and I looked at the multiple choice questions, and I went, what? You give them the answers? And we do with multiple choice, and all you have to do is recognize it. Now, here's the mistake that a lot of students make because they're so good at recognizing. They assume I'll look at that multiple choice question, and I'll choose the answer I recognize. Well, if the test designer is a poor test designer, they'll have one accurate answer, they'll have 3 distractors, and the distractors are irrelevant or weird or bizarre, and it becomes obvious because you recognize the one, and you think, okay, I got it. But if you're a good test designer, then what happens is all 4 are something they've studied. And they're going to recognize all of them, and so then they have the experience of saying, I thought I knew that, but I got the wrong answer. Why? Because you just picked the first thing you recognized. You don't really know the material. You just recognize some of it. So we've got to get past recognition. We need to study for recall and not recognition. So I advise my students when they're studying, what you need to do is if you've got a set of study notes, they're usually grouped into categories, hand them to your roommate or your study partner or whoever, and just have them say, okay, here's this category. Tell me everything you know about this category. And without any prompts, without any recognition, without any of that going on, if they can get most of the stuff in that list, then they know the material. That's how you need to study. You need to study for recall, not for recognition. Can you recall the information without any prompts? Well, that's sensory memory that invites us into that false sense of knowing because we're so good at recognition. What about short-term memory? When we take the immediate sensory process and move it forward and start trying to rehearse information, part of what happens, it's very effective when you're rehearsing, when you're kind of repeating it. So if I tell you 3, 4, 5, 7, can you repeat that?
3, 4, 5, 7.
Okay, so the only way you were able to do that is you took those numbers, you pulled them from the auditory receptors that are in the top half of your temporal lobe, and you pulled it to your frontal cortex, and you started cycling it and repeating it. Can you tell me them again?
3, 4, 5, 7.
So the way you're able to do that is it's kind of up there and it's circulating. The problem is it's forgotten fairly quickly as well, because if I asked you 3 days from now what were those numbers, probably not any of you would be able to tell me, except that maybe if you're writing them down, then we could go there, okay? And you might then somehow get it into long-term memory. But short-term memory is rehearsed, and it's limited in its capacity, which is why telephone numbers only have 7 digits. Well, how can we handle 9 when we do the area code too? I mean, think about the area code for Tulsa, which is the primary first one, which was 918. Do you think of it as one number, or do you think of it as 918? What we do is called chunking. Anytime, like with your Social Security number, where we've got 3 digits and 2 digits and 4 digits, when we chunk it, it's easier because then we can handle about 7 of those chunks. But we can't handle very much. We can extend it a little bit in terms of short-term memory with episodic memories. So if I asked you, what'd you do 2 days ago, you could probably come up with a pretty good list. But if I asked you what you did 21 days ago, you'd be hard-pressed unless you're such a creature of habit that you do the same thing every day, right? But if you kind of do a little bit different every day, you're not going to remember past 2 or 3 days. So we take kind of a really good ability to recognize, and we take our ability to kind of rehearse a little bit and maybe remember the episode of studying for a day or two, and we assume then that we can cram the night before the test and we'll pass the test. And what I get is a lot of students who do, and who are really good at this. They've learned how to combine that ability to recognize and that ability to rehearse just a little bit, and it allows them to pass the test with an A, but not know it at all for the next week, let alone for their career. So, therefore, in terms of studying, it's best not to cram the night before the exam. What I learned, once I learned all of this stuff in my graduate program, is the day or two before the test, I figured if I didn't know it, it wasn't worth knowing, and I didn't need to do anything else. And I wouldn't even review for the exam, because I knew that's a false sense of security if I'm just trying to do recognition, because a lot of the time I'll miss the answer even when I thought I did know it, if I'm just relying on that. So I would study in such a way that I didn't have to do anything the 2 or 3 days before the exam, right? And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So you may pass the test using sensory and short-term memory, but you won't remember it for later, and especially for your career where it's important, okay? So what do we want? What's the gold standard? It's long-term memory. We want long-term memory to work effectively for us. And so it's effective for retaining information across a long time span. We want it to work that way. It's distributed across the neural network. It's not in any one area of the brain. It's that associative pattern that we talked about. The problem, remember what we said? During the day, all those associations are encoding new stimuli. What you heard, what your professor said, what you read in the book, all those new stimuli are being encoded. We need that same network to be able to figure out what to store long term. We can't do that while we've got all this new stimuli coming in, so we do it at night while we're asleep. Okay? It's facilitated by the hippocampus. There's one in each part of each hemisphere of the brain, right behind the amygdala, which is our emotional center or our reaction to all those stimuli that are coming in. We've got this hippocampus, and what it does, it's not where memory is stored, but it's active in helping with those associations across the whole brain, that complex pattern that's associated with any piece of learning. And so it's a process of consolidating and organizing the learning into this long-term process, and it's best if it's a result of spaced distributed exposure. And this is going to be one of the keys to learning that I'm going to talk about today. And especially if it's over many times with sleep in between. How many of you have ever heard somebody say, "Oh, that's a great idea, but I need to sleep on it. I'll get back with you." Okay? What's that about? When we take an idea and mull it over and then sleep, that's where that consolidation and integration occurs. Then we come back the next day. We're more creative. We're more tied into that information because it all happens at night while we're sleeping. Okay? So, going back to our diagram of these 90 minutes, here's where learning occurs. In those 2 deep wave sleep sessions, particularly the level 4, the deepest level, that's where those facts, if you got to memorize a whole bunch of terms or a whole bunch of facts, you really need this deep wave sleep. But guess what we've said? If you're drinking caffeine after 2 o'clock, guess what you don't get? Anytime you drink caffeine after 2 o'clock, you're going to maybe go down here, maybe skirt with level 3, but you're going to stay here and you're unconscious, so you think you're sleeping the whole night, but you're never going to go down there because the caffeine's blocking the adenosine receptors. And that's where, if you've got to memorize a lot of facts and terms, which do we have to do that a lot in college? You're sabotaging your ability to do that well, at least for long term. Now remember, we're really good at recognition, so you're hoping that it's a multiple choice question and you'll recognize that on the next day on the exam, and you might pass that, but you're not going to know it a week later, and you're definitely not going to know it a year, 2 years, 3 years later in your career. Okay? So this is critical. We've got to cut out the caffeine so you get that. Now look at what's happening with REM sleep. Every stage is getting a little bit longer. So if you're like the typical college student who gets 5 hours of sleep a night because they tell themselves, I've got too much to do, and unless I stay up, I'm not going to be effective, look how many of these you get at 5 hours. You only get the first 2 smallest. So all of the ability to integrate everything else that you might learn over long term is sabotaged because the greatest links, and by the way, if you get 9 hours of sleep, this actually goes much longer than any of the others. If you get 8.5 to 9 hours of sleep, you really have these last 3 really good consolidation experiences of your learning material. But most college students get 5 to 6 hours of sleep, so they're cutting off the most significant portion of long-term integration of memory. So caffeine consumption cuts off the declarative knowledge. Short sleep cycles cut off the procedural knowledge, and between the two, you've effectively sabotaged your ability to be effective as a learner. Okay? So, adequate adenosine for deep wave sleep and 8 to 10 hours of sleep for enough REM sleep are critical. Long-term memory consolidation happens best with little or no caffeine and 8 to 10 hours of sleep for an adult. So, if we know that's occurring while we sleep, how can we capitalize on that and use it to best advantage? Well, what do we know about long-term memory? There are different kinds. Some of it's declarative memory, like the facts that we were talking about, like I know what a guitar is. That's a fact. A name of a word tied with an object. That's a fact that I know, okay? But I also know some facts about episodes that have happened in my life. I can remember when I bought the guitar. That's an episode in my life. And that's a fact, too. It's a sequence of facts and a series of events that we call an episode. All of those are that declarative memory, and those are best learned in that deep wave sleep that we sabotage if we've got too much caffeine. On the other side, how do I play that guitar? And how much of the learning at college is taking some facts and learning how to apply them to problem solving? So I hear students all the time at the collegiate level going, I wish you just had the terminology questions. It's killing me when you give all these scenarios and I've got to try and figure out which piece is which. Well, that's the application part, right? And that's going to happen if you've got that 8 to 10 hours of sleep, but it's going to be harder to get those kinds of things if you've only got 5 to 6 hours of sleep, okay? So, knowing all that, let's say you cut back on the caffeine and you still are consuming caffeine, but you stop it after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're trying to get 8 to 10 hours of sleep on a consistent level every night. Now what else can I do to take advantage of how this long-term memory consolidation actually works in my brain? What can I do? Well, rehearsal. There's no substitute for it, because what we know about the neurons is when two neurons fire together, the more often they do that, the more likely they're to fire together in the future. We actually see what we call synaptic plasticity. It's like plastic you can mold and shape. The synapses in our brain are actually changing physically with repeated exposure to something. The dendrites get a thinner neck, so there's less resistance. Sometimes the postsynaptic membrane splits into two, so we end up having twice the signal. There's this whole change in that, and we actually see the gray matter, the cortex, get thicker in those areas where learning is occurring. So there's physical changes that are happening along with repetition. So there's no substitute for rehearsal or repetition. Elaboration, because the brain is fundamentally an associative phenomenon. If I can add to or elaborate or tie to something else I already know, the learning is going to happen even faster and better. Organizing, to rearrange according to some system, is going to help, and we're going to talk about all four of these here in just a minute in more detail. Mnemonic devices, any kind of an associative process that you can create that helps you remember more effectively, we're going to dive into just briefly. So rehearsal, let's talk about that. Flashcards work, but it's the slowest way to learn. The reason they work is because you're repeating over and over and over. But you remember I've said the brain is fundamentally an associative process. It's learning to make connections in multiple directions between sight, sound, smell, touch, activity, memories, all of that kind of stuff. So you've already got a neural path and network set up. If you tie something new into the pattern that's already there, it's going to be a lot easier to learn it than to create a whole brand new neural pattern, right? So anytime that we can do flashcards, it's like trying to create a whole new neural pattern. And if I repeat it enough, you'll create that. But it's one of the slowest ways of learning, okay? So this space-distributed rehearsal works the best for creating these tied networks. Multiple short study times work better than one large study time, which is why the cramming doesn't work very well. Because what I learned as I became that master's level student starting to make a 4.0 on these principles, what I learned is I can spend half of the time and learn it far better than all the time that I was spending the days or two before the exam. If I just spread it out. I could take 8 hours of study time the day before an exam, but if I took 4 hours and spread it out in 15-minute increments over 2 weeks, I would know the material far better than the 8 hours of study time. So not only am I suggesting there's a better way to learn, but I'm going to suggest that it's a more time-efficient way to learn, that you really exponentially increase your capacity to retain information by just doing it the right way, okay? So you can learn more in less time if you'll spread it out over time, and with sleep in between each of those times, because remember, we integrate things while we're asleep, okay? So we've known for more than 100 years now, ever since the research that Hermann Ebbinghaus did, that you can cut your study time in half if you'll distribute it over multiple study times. But that means some good time management skills. Instead of thinking, okay, I'm going to study one big long session, the day before the exam, and then thinking, okay, but I've got 5 other exams, so I'm going to spend one whole day before this other one, and you consume all your days with these long chunks. If instead what you would do is cut back and do 15-minute segments where you keep repeating with sleep in between each segment, it's going to be a lot less time. It just means you have to be good at time management and farming it out instead of trying to do it all at once, okay? But once you learn that skill, you're going to be surprised how much better of a social life you have, because you got more time to be with your friends. You're going to be surprised how much better grades you have because you're retaining it more effectively, okay? So another thing is elaboration. So the brain is fundamentally an associative process, which is what we've already talked about. It's trying to connect all these things. And so if you can tie what you're learning to something you already know, then it's going to be easier to learn. You've already got a network, you're just piggybacking one more piece, and you only have to make that one pathway fresh instead of the whole network. Okay? So by telling a story, elaborating, tying it to a memory, or associating with something else. That's why in almost all my classes where I teach, I give real-world examples from my clinical experience, or I bring in examples from my children and raising them as a parent. I'll pull all that in because if I can tell a story about it, it's going to be easier to remember than if I just have the fact all by itself. Okay, because I'm tying into procedure as well. I'm that declarative and procedural knowledge. If I'm pulling all that in a story form, it's easier to remember. And what I tell students is, if it's your story, it'll be even easier to remember than if it's the one that I tell in class. So when you're sitting there, it may take a minute or two to say, okay, we've got this fact or this name of this event or process in this course, or the biology, chemistry, or whatever it is, and it's like, okay, what kind of silly story or what happened in my life that would relate to that? And if you just take that second to ask that question and associate it with something, then you're not going to have to be doing the flashcard near as long because it'll already be tied in, okay? So even the material that's completely new and not related to anything else that you've ever experienced, if you create some story about it, you'll be able to learn it easier. So let me just work with you here for a second. I want you to attend to the words that are going to be in this green box as they flash on the screen. I don't want you to write anything down, but after the last word shows up on the screen, then I want you to try and, in your mind, tell me what all the words were that you saw. Okay? And I'm purposely going to go past 7 because we want to see if you can do some long-term memory stuff, at least in the short term here. Okay? So here we go. Okay, so now that you've seen all the words, can somebody tell me what all 10 words are?
Cat, bread, door, yeah, that's right, door, hat, table, sun,
Cat.
yes, cat was in the beginning. So yeah, it's boot, then there's snow, sun, bus.
Okay, so how were you able to do that?
I made a really weird story.
Okay, so you hear what he said. He's elaborating. What's the weird story?
So there's basically this evil cat villain, and he wanted to get some bread. So then he heard a knock on the door, and there was a man with a hat who had some bread, but then he put his boots on the table. And he said, "I'll give you this bread, but only if you give me back my son. He was trapped in the snow." And so they do the exchange, the man's with his son, and they ride home on a bus.
Okay, so do you see what he did? He elaborated the details and told a story. Since we make associations, when you have to make an association to tell a story like that, you're going to not only have the material learned more effectively, but you're going to have more retrieval cues. So I was in a class the other day where I invited students to do this, and they came up with a cat in the hat, took the bread off the table. When they went out the door, their foot tripped on the dog. They fell against their son, who fell into the snow, but he was on the way to the bus when all that happened, okay? And so they're able to remember all of them because you elaborate it. So I always tell this about my father-in-law. He would take like 3 days to do a 15-minute project because he had all these sapling trees. We have this 80-acre ranch, and he had all these sapling trees that the National Forestry Department were going to give him credit for his tax on a farm if he would plant these trees because they're trying to keep certain kinds of trees in the area. And so how do you water 3,000 little evergreen seedlings in Oklahoma hot summers? That can take half a day. So what he did is he drove around for 3 days, found a store where he had this little pump that would plug into a cigarette lighter, and then he got 2 55-gallon drums in the back of his truck, filled them up with water, put a hose in it, put it to the pump, plugged it in the cigarette lighter, and held a hose out his window and did a drive-by. And in just a few minutes, it took him 3 days to figure out the system and get the equipment, but from then on, he's doing in 5 or 10 minutes what was taking half a day before every day. You see where I'm going? That's what happens with elaboration. It may take you a minute or two to come up with a story, but how much longer are you going to retain the information because you associated it with all of that and told the story about it, elaborated it some way, or tied it into some memory that you already have, okay? Organization is also useful. Anytime you organize material, it becomes easier to learn. So how many of you ever in a history class did a timeline? Why is that timeline helpful? Because you can figure out where everybody fits. There's some kind of organizational scheme, so then it's easier to remember the events as they occurred because you've organized it somehow. Well, we can do that in any class. We can take information that we have and tie it in some kind of organizational structure ahead of time. Then it's easier to remember where it goes, but it's also easier to retrieve it because we don't just need to encode the information and store it. We need to be able to retrieve it later, and that gives you more of a retrieval success as you do that. Also, these mnemonic devices can be helpful, like a visual image. So if you're going to have to remember Rosa Parks and what she's known for, maybe you could have her sitting on a park bench surrounded by roses as she waits for the bus to pull up. Okay? The occipital lobe, the whole back half of the brain, the occipital lobe, is what we use for vision, but also the whole bottom half of the temporal lobe and the whole back half of the parietal lobe. We use more of our brain for visual stimuli than any other part or process. So if you can tie something you're trying to learn to a visual image, like a rose bush and a park bench, then Rosa Parks is easier to remember because you're accessing the biggest part of your brain, creating that visual image. We had a memory expert come to chapel when I was a student here at ORU back in the dark ages. And part of what happened then is he did this amazing stuff with memory. And what he said is you can memorize the whole New Testament. Well, how did he do it? He had a card for every chapter of the Bible. And on the card, I remember thinking, this is pretty cool. I want to get that and see if I can do it. And I did. I learned it. In fact, the President Wilson had me on stage in chapel a few years back quoting the whole first part of Matthew, which is the genealogies, because I figured if I can learn that, I can learn anything, right? The begat this and begat that, and I thought, okay, I want to see it. Well, the part that comes right after the genealogies is now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph before they had come together, she was found great with child, and it was of the whole, the whole thing. But how he had this represented, tying into the visual, is she shall bear a son. So there's a grizzly bear holding a son. Thou shalt call him Emmanuel. His name, Emmanuel, was in the son, okay? And she's a virgin, so he's got a furry gin bottle. Just ridiculous stuff, but it's a visual. It's something you see that helps you remember the details. So anytime you elaborate or use visual stuff, how about an acrostic? The lines on the treble clef, every good boy does fine. Well, E, G, B, D, F are the names of the musical lines on the treble clef. So if you can put an acrostic together where you make up a sentence and the first letter of each word is the cue for what you want, or how about an acronym? Like, how many of you ever remembered the Great Lakes by the word Holmes? Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior, right? So instead of having to remember all 5 of them, all you have to do is remember one word, and it's your jump-off point to remember the rest, okay? So we're making associations and creating retrieval cues and all that kind of stuff. What about rhymes and alliteration? I know some of you learned the months that have 31 days by your knuckles, but for me it was always 30 days has September, April, June, and November. Now I'm dealing with rhyme and cadence. Do you see where I'm going with that? And rhythm, kind of the whole lilt to that, and the whole rhyming process. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. And now I know which ones have 30 because of that alliteration in other parts of my brain, right? And then chunking, we've already talked about. Method of loci, that's kind of an interesting thing. How many of you have a real path that you go every day? Like in this example, if it were your house, you go through the front entry, then you go through the living room, and you go up the stairs to your bedroom. And so they said if you've got stuff you have to memorize on a shopping list, So what do? They say, put the bananas in the entryway, a puddle of milk in the middle of your sofa, eggs going up the stairs, and bread on your bed. So when you see yourself going through your house, the thing you do every day, it reminds you, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to get bananas, I'm supposed to get milk, I'm supposed to get eggs, and I'm supposed to get bread, because you can just see it there. Again, we're tying into the visual part of the brain. These are all different ways of elaboration, of association, of tying in. Now, this is the biggest key that I can give you. We're kind of winding down here, and I want to give you the biggest, most revelatory thing that happened for me as a student learning how to learn. And that is this. The night before you go to bed, not right before you go to bed, because if you do it right before you go to bed, then what happens is you're awake and thinking about it and you don't just fall right asleep. But an hour before you're going to go to bed, anything that was important that happened that day, whether it was something you heard a professor say in class, whether it's something you read, something you studied, anything that's important, just kind of make a quick list of it and review it. Now, this is not a study time. This shouldn't take more than 10 or 15 minutes. It's just a quick review. What were the most important things that happened today? Now, why is this important? Because when we do sleep studies in the laboratory and then look at concentration the next day and ability to cognitively remember stuff, what we find is the things that were reviewed later in the evening are processed far more at night while you sleep than the things that happened earlier in the day. So your classes are earlier in the day. The studying is earlier in the day. What do we want to do? We want to remind ourselves of what we covered earlier in the day, because that's going to jumpstart this process that we said happens while you sleep, both in the deep wave sleep and in those REM stages of sleep. Okay? Then, during your morning ritual, you're not going to take any extra time for this. While you're taking your shower, brushing your teeth, whatever, cold turkey, recall, not recognition. Remember, that's not the key. Total recall without any prompts. While you're taking your shower, brushing your teeth, just try to remember everything that was on the list that you reviewed the night before. Recall as much as you can from the night before with no prompts, and then try to retrieve everything. Try not to leave anything out that you reviewed that night before. Finally, when you get back to your room, after your shower or whatever, go back and look at your list and see if you missed anything. Now, I promise you what will happen is the first couple of weeks you do this, not much will occur, because your brain's not used to the demand that you're putting on it, but it'll get used to it fairly quickly. About 3 or 4 weeks in, you're going to be surprised that you're remembering everything on the list every night. And remember, we said space-distributed rehearsal with sleep in between makes a big difference. If you're doing this every night, you're kind of jump-starting that process that happens at night and saying, these are the most important things, and I'm going to demand them in the morning, so focus on them. And after you do that for a couple of weeks, you're going to be surprised. You just know the material. You're not having to go back and spend all those extra hours studying. You're not having to do all the flashcards. You just know it. And you're not going to have that experience on your tests where you look at it when you get your grade back and you go, I knew the right answer. Why did I choose that one? That won't happen anymore, because you're going to know the material. You're not just going to recognize it. You're going to actually know it. And you're going to know it not just for a little while. You're going to know it for much later in your career. So let me sum all this up. Given everything we know about sleep and caffeine and everything we know about studying and elaborating and organizing and all that, how should you read your book for your class and use that information to study? Here's the steps. And this is what I did to be a 4.0 student all the way through my graduate program. Number 1, preview the material. So the first week of class, every class that I would ever have, I'd scan the entire book. Okay, I'm not trying to read it. I'm not trying to do anything but what David Ausubel calls an advanced organizer. Remember, we said one of the things you can do is to organize the material that's going to help remember it. I want to have an overview of what the whole semester is. So I'm just going to flip through the book. I'm not reading it. I'm not paying attention to details. I'm not studying any terms. I'm just looking to see what's everything in here. I'm just going to go page by page. It may take me 20 minutes to do the entire book. Now, most professors would go, what? Why are you just flipping through pages? But it's important. Just flip through every page, see what's there, and keep going. You're not trying to memorize anything. You're just wanting to get an overview of what's there. You want an advanced organizer. Because if How many of you have ever had like a mud room in your house or a place where you hang your coats or whatever? As long as you got a place for everything and it's in its place, the next day when you want to find your keys, you can find them. You're not searching the whole house if you always put them in the same place, right? If you always hang your coat there, you know where they are. If you always put your boots there, you know where they are, and you just go there the next day. Same thing with the brain. If you have an advanced organizer, a place, okay, when the professor covers this in class, that's where it goes. When they cover this, well, in the timeline we made in the history class, that's where it goes, okay? If you've got that place, it's going to be easier to pull it back later because you've got that organization. So preview it. The second thing you want to do is question. Okay, one of the things we know is intrinsic motivation is far more effective than extrinsic. If you're just taking a class because it's on your degree plan sheet, you won't learn it as easily and as effectively if you're taking a class because there's something in it that's really interesting to you. Okay? So when you preview the whole thing, ask this question. What's kind of interesting in there? What's fascinating? What do I really want to know? I mean, it's like they covered this, this, and that. Wow. I wonder what that's about. Okay? The more of those things you can identify after that preview, the better. Okay? Then, and this is before the lecture that the professor's giving, actually read it, the material. Read it like a novel, though. Don't read it to study. And this is the mistake most students make, is the first time they try to read something, they assume they've got to study, understand all the terms and all the details and all that, so they get so bogged down in the details that they don't get the whole chapter. How many of you have started to read and fall asleep, and then you start to read again and you fall asleep? Why? Because you're not reading it like you read a novel. I mean, when you read a novel, do you fall asleep or do you do the whole chapter, right? Okay? So read it like a novel. Not that you're going to memorize any terms or get into any detail. You're just going to read the whole thing. Okay? So now you not only have a preview of where things fit, but now you have a general summary of the whole thing. Then reflect. Anybody ever hear the experience or the saying, experience is the best teacher? And I always ask students when they agree with that, I say, then why do so many people make the same stupid mistakes over and over again? Maybe it's not the experience that's the best teacher. Maybe it's the time you take to reflect on the experience where the learning occurs. Did that work? Did it not work? What do I like about that? What's foreign or new about this material that I've never seen before? What resonates with me that I really like? Ask those kind of questions. Reflect on what you've read when you were just reading it like a novel. Again, we were not trying to study detail or terminology or clarify the things we didn't understand. We're just trying to ask, what do I understand? What's new? What's different? What do I like? All that kind of stuff. Then go to class and listen to your professor. At that point, you've already been exposed to the material several times, so when the professor talks about it, now they might bring a different light. They might put it in more approachable terms, and so the techno-speak or psychobabble that's part of the class and the textbook, the professor might bring it down to real-world, everyday language and make it more approachable for you, but you've got something to compare all that to, right? And then, now's the time, now that you've had exposure to the book and to your professor, is the time to study, rehearse, repeat terms, clarify uncertainties, get into the definitions of terms you don't understand, some of that kind of stuff. Because once you do that, now you've got a context for it. You kind of know where it fits. If you're trying to do that the first time you read through the book, you don't have any place to hang it. Do you hear what I'm saying? So by waiting till later to get to that level, now, oh yeah, that fits here. That goes with this part of the chapter. That's I understand now. And then finally, now's where we review and retrieve it. If you're doing that every night, an hour before you go to bed, and every morning during your shower or brushing your teeth, and then especially, you know, the week before the exam, you're reviewing and retrieving. But if you've been doing it every night and every morning, what you're going to be surprised is doing all of this, you can take, well, I got it down to a third of the time that I was studying before. Ebbinghaus talked about in his research 100 years ago, and that we've been able to replicate ever since, about a half of the time. But I think the more effective you become at that nighttime review and early morning retrieval, I think you're going to be surprised. You've got a lot of free time all of a sudden. So what I'm inviting you to do is become effective learners by using the way the brain actually works instead of fighting against it. When you don't sleep enough, you're fighting against your ability to learn. When you drink too much caffeine, you're fighting against your ability to learn. When you don't do space-distributed rehearsal, which is the way the brain works, it encodes when two neurons repeatedly fire together. That's the way the brain works. And if you're cramming right before the test, you're fighting against the way the brain works. So what I'm inviting you to do is understand how does the brain work in retaining information over a long time, and then to modify your lifestyle through sleep patterns, through caffeine consumption, and through space-distributed rehearsal and time management so that you become an effective learner, which makes all the difference in the world. And that's what I've been sharing with students for 23 years, and hopefully it makes a difference for you. I know it has for me, and it has for hundreds of those students. Now, I will say this as a qualifier, the number one impediment to this is a lot of college students aren't willing to cut back on their caffeine consumption. So they can just guarantee that they can't consolidate those memories because it cuts off the deep wave sleep if they do it after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay? And a lot of students aren't willing to sleep 8 to 10 hours a night. Got too much to do, too much social stuff going on. I got too many classes to turn assignments in for. But what we know from the sleep lab research is that if you'll get the 8-10 hours of sleep, your waking hours will be far more productive. You'll retain information, and like I said, you can cut into a half or a third of the study time, which means you have more free time, and you're going to be far more effective even though you're spending less time overall trying to consolidate this learning because you've capitalized on the way the brain actually works. So those are the big impediments. Changing your lifestyle around sleep, changing your lifestyle around caffeine, and changing your lifestyle around space-distributed rehearsal. If you'll do those three, it'll make all the difference in the world. That's where we're going to stop.